You should be deported. This is America. Speak English. The words, sharp as glass, shattered the afternoon calm of the office. My breath hitched. My blood ran cold, then instantly boiled with a hot, indignant rage. This woman, this Karen, as she would forever be known in my mind, her face a mask of twisted fury, was actually screaming for my deportation. All because I was speaking Spanish. My native tongue, on a crucial client call, no less. My mind reeled, struggling to form a defense, a retort, anything to combat the sheer audacity. But just as her tirade reached its venomous peak, a shadow fell across my desk. The air in the entire office seemed to shift, to hold its breath. And as I saw who stood there, a stunned silence finally falling upon Karen, a tiny, incredulous thought sparked through my fury. Oh, you have absolutely no idea what you've just unleashed. The epic downfall about to unfold was almost beautiful in its karmic perfection. My name is Isabella, but my family and closest friends call me ISA. I've always considered myself a pretty grounded person. I believe in working hard, treating people with kindness, and trying to find the humor even in stressful situations. As a project manager at a mid-sized marketing firm, my days were typically a structured chaos of deadlines, client presentations, and coordinating with my team. I genuinely enjoyed the challenge, the problem-solving aspect of it all. I'm a woman who thrives on clear communication and meticulous organization, which I suppose made me a good fit for the role. Growing up in a vibrant, bilingual household, Spanish was woven into the fabric of my life. My abuela, who lived with us, spoke mostly Spanish, so it was the language of comfort, of whispered family secrets, of laughter over her amazing cooking. It was just a part of who I am, as natural as breathing, and I never imagined it could become a weapon used against me. My family is close-knit. We celebrate each other's successes, big or small. My cousin David, for example, has done incredibly well for himself in the corporate world, starting out at Henderson Marketing, the very company I worked for years ago. We didn't see him at our specific branch often, as his role had him overseeing much larger territories, but Abuela always talked about his achievements with such pride. Our office was a fairly standard open-plan space. Low cubicle walls that offered minimal privacy, a shared kitchen that perpetually smelled of either microwaved fish or burnt popcorn, and the usual mix of personalities you encounter in any workplace. There was cheerful Dave from accounting, whose dad jokes were legendary for their awfulness, Sarah from the design team, who always had the most interesting imported snacks, and Mr. Henderson Sr., the company's elderly and mostly figurehead owner, who occasionally wandered through, looking amiably bewildered. It was, all things considered, a generally pleasant and productive environment. I had my own little corner, personalized with a few framed photos, a perpetually optimistic miniature cactus, and a stress ball shaped like a cat that saw more action than I'd like to admit. Life was stable, predictable, and for the most part, quite good. Then Carol arrived, and the predictability shattered. Her official name was Carol, but from the moment I laid eyes on her, she was the Karen. She was a new hire in the administrative department, a role that meant our paths would cross occasionally for things like booking conference rooms or processing travel expenses. The first time I saw her, I distinctly remember thinking she looked like she'd been assembled from a professional complainer action figure set. She sported that aggressively angled, heavily highlighted blonde bob, the kind that looks like it could double as a weapon. Even indoors, she frequently had a pair of oversized, expensive-looking sunglasses perched atop her head like a conquering queen's crown. Her daily attire consisted mainly of high-end athleisure wear, suggesting she was either perpetually on her way to a punishing Pilates class or about to demand a refund for insufficiently organic avocados. And her nails. Oh, her nails were always impeccably manicured, long, and filed to sharp points, seemingly designed for maximum impact when pointing accusingly. My first direct interaction with her was illuminating, and not in a good way. I was on a brief personal call during my designated lunch break, standing near a window in a quieter corridor of the office. My tia Elena was calling from Puerto Rico, bubbling with excitement about my cousin's upcoming wedding plans. We were chattering away happily in Spanish, sharing a laugh about a funny family story. The call lasted no more than 5 minutes. As I hung up, still smiling, I turned and nearly collided with Carol. She was standing just a few feet away, arms tightly crossed over her chest, lips pursed into a thin, disapproving line. One perfectly sculpted eyebrow was arched so high it threatened to disappear into her meticulously maintained hairline. "Well," she began, her voice a strange concoction of syrupy sweetness and underlying acid, "I just think it's incredibly rude to speak in, well, other languages in a professional environment. Some of us only understand English, you know." I was so taken aback by the unprovoked comment that I just blinked at her for a moment. "Excuse me," I finally managed to say, my mind trying to process her words. "I was on a personal call during my lunch break." "Still," she sniffed, giving the enormous, branded leather bag on her shoulder a slight, dismissive hoist. "It's a matter of respect. This is an American company. We should be speaking American." She didn't say English. She very pointedly said American, as if it were a distinct, superior dialect. A flush of heat crept up my neck, and I felt my jaw tighten. "Spanish is spoken by millions of Americans," I informed her, keeping my voice as level and calm as I possibly could. And, again, it was a private conversation on my own time. She just gave a small, impatient wave of her hand, her glinting nails catching the light. "Whatever," she said with utter dismissal. "Just something for you to consider." And with that parting shot, she turned on her heel and strode away, leaving me fuming and utterly bewildered. Who on earth says something like that to a colleague? That was my introduction to Carol, and unfortunately, it was merely the unsettling overture. The full opera of her entitlement was yet to unfold, and I had a dreadful premonition that this was only the beginning of a very unpleasant series of encounters. I could already feel a knot of anxiety forming in my stomach. My premonition, sadly, proved to be spot on. Over the subsequent weeks, Carol seemed to appoint herself the unofficial language police of the office, with me as her primary target. It began with subtle but pointed actions. If I was on a brief, quiet call with my mom in Spanish during my break, just checking in or reminding her about a doctor's appointment, Carol would inevitably find a reason to walk past my cubicle, letting out a loud, theatrical sigh. A sigh laden with so much disapproval it could curdle milk. One afternoon, I was in the break room heating up my lunch. My colleague, Maria, who was also bilingual, happened to be in there as well. We were chatting casually about our weekend plans, slipping in and out of Spanish and English effortlessly, Spanglish as we often did, the way friends who share languages do. Carol entered, took one sweeping glance at us, and then announced to the empty microwave, loud enough for everyone to hear, "It's so incredibly difficult to feel included when people are constantly having secret conversations around you." She didn't look directly at us, but her meaning was as clear as her disdain. Maria shot me an exasperated eye roll when Carol's back was turned, but I just felt that familiar knot of frustration tighten in my gut. I tried my best to ignore her, to rise above her pettiness, but it was like enduring a persistent, annoying mosquito buzzing constantly in my ear. Then came the email. It landed in my inbox with a thud, metaphorically speaking. It was addressed directly to me, with a curious CC to a very junior HR assistant, not the HR manager, or even an HR generalist, which struck me as odd and manipulative. The subject line read, "Professional Communication Standards in the Workplace." My blood ran a little colder even before I clicked it open. The email itself was a masterclass in passive-aggressive corporate speak. Carol wrote at length about the paramount importance of fostering an inclusive and transparent environment and how, in her esteemed opinion, using languages not universally understood by all team members could regrettably lead to misunderstandings, feelings of exclusion, and a potential breakdown in team cohesion. She never explicitly named me as the transgressor in the body of the email, but since it was sent directly to me, the accusation was unmistakable. She even had the gall to cite a completely fabricated company policy about English being the designated primary language for all internal and external communications. My hands were actually trembling with a mixture of anger and disbelief as I read it. How dare she? My first instinct was to check the official company handbook. Of course, there was no such policy. Our company prided itself on its international business dealings. Diversity and inclusion were supposedly core values, frequently touted in company-wide memos. I took several deep, calming breaths. I briefly considered marching directly over to her desk and giving her a piece of my mind. I also contemplated forwarding her ridiculous email to the actual HR manager, along with a strongly worded formal complaint. But then, a calmer part of me decided, no, I would handle this directly, professionally, face-to-face. I walked over to Carol's meticulously organized desk. She was, as usual, engaged in some form of personal grooming, this time meticulously filing her already perfect nails. She looked up with an expression of bored impatience when she noticed me standing there. "Carol," I began, keeping my voice deliberately calm and low, "I received your email." "Oh, good," she replied, not missing a single stroke with her nail file, her tone feigning innocence. "I was hoping it would, clarify things for you." "There is absolutely no company policy," I stated, firmly but politely, "that dictates English as the sole language to be used, particularly for personal conversations during breaks or when it's professionally necessary for business dealings. And frankly, Carol, I find your constant unsolicited comments and now this highly inappropriate email to be specifically targeted and quite offensive." She finally deigned to put down her nail file and gave me her full, undivided attention, a condescending smirk playing on her lips. "Well, Isabella," she said, drawing out my name as if it tasted unpleasant. "Perhaps if you were a bit more considerate of those around you, these helpful clarifications wouldn't be necessary. Some people, it seems, just don't understand how to behave appropriately in a professional American workplace." The sheer, unmitigated audacity of her statement left me momentarily speechless. I could feel the heat rising in my cheeks. "My behavior is perfectly professional, Carol," I retorted, my patience wearing dangerously thin. "Your relentless attempts to police my language and dictate my personal conversations, however, are profoundly unprofessional and unwarranted. I am asking you, as politely as I still can, to stop." She leaned back in her chair, the very picture of smug, unassailable self-righteousness. "Is that some sort of threat?" she inquired, her voice laced with mock concern. "It is a request," I said, though the word threat was becoming increasingly appealing in my mind. "A request to be treated with basic human decency and professional respect." Carol just shrugged, a tiny, dismissive gesture that spoke volumes. "I'll certainly keep your feedback in mind," she drawled, before pointedly turning back to her nails. I knew in that instant that my attempt at a polite, direct resolution had utterly failed. She clearly interpreted my professionalism as weakness, my composure as an open invitation to escalate her campaign of harassment. The knot in my stomach tightened into a painful fist. This wasn't just about language anymore. This was about her desperate need to feel superior, to exert some bizarre, petty control over someone else. And I had a chilling feeling that she was far from finished. The escalation was undeniable, and I started to genuinely worry about what form her next attack might take. Each workday began to feel like navigating a minefield, constantly bracing for her next thinly veiled insult or outright, baseless complaint. The stress was a gnawing undercurrent, slowly poisoning what had once been a job I truly enjoyed. The subsequent couple of weeks became an exercise in enduring Carol's escalating campaign of microaggressions and, at times, overt hostility. She'd conveniently forget passive-aggressive articles on the shared printer, articles with titles like The Importance of Workplace Etiquette for a Harmonious Office, or, more pointedly, Assimilation and Professional Success for Immigrants, despite the fact I was born and raised in the United States. If I happened to be on a necessary work call that required me to speak Spanish with a client from Mexico or a vendor in Colombia, she would make it a point to walk past my desk multiple times, sighing with exaggerated drama, or even muttering just loud enough for me to hear, things like, "I just can't concentrate with all that gibberish going on." I did report her escalating behavior to my direct manager, Mark. Mark was a fundamentally decent guy, but he was also notoriously conflict avoidant, a man who would rather endure slow torture than have an uncomfortable conversation. He listened with a semblance of sympathy, nodded in all the right places, and assured me he'd have a quiet word with Carol about the importance of maintaining a respectful and inclusive office environment. I'm still not entirely sure what kind of word he actually had with her, or if he even spoke to her at all, because Carol's behavior didn't just continue. It seemed to get bolder, as if she'd been given a green light, or perhaps she simply knew she could get away with it without any real consequences. She then started to subtly scrutinize my work, publicly questioning my project timelines in team meetings, always with a thinly veiled implication that perhaps my supposed divided attention, a clear and derogatory nod to my bilingualism, was somehow impacting my professional performance. It was infuriating, and I found myself constantly on the defensive, having to justify my competence and work ethic against her insidious insinuations. One particularly nasty incident involved a set of crucial presentation materials I'd prepared for a new client pitch. I'd left them in a clearly marked folder on my desk to pick up after meeting. When I returned, the folder was gone. Panic set in. After a frantic search, I found it misfiled in a stack of unrelated documents in the admin supply closet, a place Carol frequented. When I, trying to keep my cool, asked if she'd seen it, she just gave me a blank, innocent stare and said, "Oh dear, things do get misplaced when people aren't organized, don't they?" I couldn't prove she'd moved it, but the timing and her smirk told me everything. I managed to retrieve it just in time, but the stress and near miss were palpable. The office atmosphere grew increasingly tense and uncomfortable. Some of my more observant colleagues clearly noticed Carol's targeted behavior and would offer me sympathetic glances or quiet words of support when she wasn't around, but no one ever openly challenged her. She possessed this uncanny ability to make everyone around her deeply uncomfortable, and most people, understandably, just wanted to avoid becoming her next target. I felt increasingly isolated, stressed, and disheartened. My initial love for my job was rapidly curdling into resentment. I began meticulously documenting everything: dates, times, specific comments, witnesses if any, and of course, the infamous email. I wasn't entirely sure what I planned to do with this growing dossier, but I had a persistent feeling, a gut instinct, that I might need it sooner rather than later. My abuela always had a saying, 10 tus papers listos, always have your papers ready, your proof in hand. It was sage advice that I was now taking very, very literally. The breaking point, the glorious, karmic implosion that this whole story has been leading up to, finally occurred on a particularly hectic Tuesday afternoon. I was deeply engrossed in a very important and rather technically complicated video conference call. We were in the final stages of finalizing a massive campaign launch with a new, extremely high-profile client based in Argentina. The internet connection was being a bit temperamental, and their lead marketing director, a very distinguished gentleman named Mr. Alvarez, was politely expressing some difficulty in fully understanding a complex contractual clause I was explaining in English. He courteously asked if, to ensure complete clarity, I could perhaps clarify that specific point for him in Spanish, as his English, while generally excellent, wasn't quite up to parsing dense legal jargon at speed. "Of course, Señor Alvarez," I responded immediately, switching seamlessly into Spanish. Permítame explicar este punto en español para asegurar que todo esté perfectamente claro. I then proceeded to carefully and thoroughly break down the intricate details of the clause for him. It took a few minutes of careful explanation, with some back and forth, to ensure he understood every nuance and implication. This was a multi-million-dollar account. Absolute clarity was not just important, it was paramount. Suddenly, I heard the violent scrape of a chair on the floor behind me. I instinctively glanced over my shoulder, my microphone momentarily muted. There was Carol. She was on her feet, marching with furious determination towards my cubicle, her face a mask of incandescent rage. Her blonde bob seemed to vibrate with the intensity of her fury, and her perfectly manicured index finger was already extended, pointing accusingly in my direction. Before I could even begin to react or brace myself, she was right there, looming over my desk, leaning in so close I could feel the heat radiating from her. "What did I tell you?" she hissed, her voice loud enough to carry through the otherwise quiet office, despite my attempt to keep the situation contained, about speaking that foreign language in this office. I quickly unmuted my microphone. "Señor Alvarez, un momento. Por favor," I said, trying desperately to keep the rising panic out of my voice. I then muted it again and turned to face Carol directly, my own anger finally starting to boil over, threatening to breach my carefully constructed professional composure. "Carol, I am in the middle of an extremely important business-critical client call." "I don't care what kind of call it is," she seethed, her voice escalating with every word. "You are being deliberately disrespectful and grossly unprofessional. This is America. You need to speak English. Only English." Her voice was now rising to a near shriek, attracting shocked stares from everyone in our section of the office. Heads were popping up over cubicle walls like a field of startled meerkats, all eyes fixed on the unfolding drama at my desk. "Carol, you are actively disrupting a major client negotiation," I said, my voice low and firm, still attempting, foolishly perhaps, to de-escalate the situation, even though my insides were churning with a toxic mix of fury and adrenaline. "You need to step away from my desk. Now." But she was far beyond reason. It was as if a sanity switch had been flipped to the off position. "No, you need to learn your place," she shrieked, her face now turning an alarming shade of puce. "People like you come here to our country, and you think you can just do whatever you want, speaking your foreign languages whenever you please. You should be fired. In fact, you should be deported. Go back to where you came from if you can't respect our ways and our language." Deported. She had actually, unequivocally demanded that I, an American citizen, born and raised in this country, be deported. The sheer, unadulterated xenophobia of her outburst struck me dumb. My mouth fell open. I could feel the blood drain from my face, only to rush back with a hot, overwhelming wave of righteous fury. All around us, the office had fallen into a stunned, absolute silence, broken only by Carol's heavy, enraged breathing. And just then, at that precise, hyperdramatic moment of peak Karen meltdown, the heavy oak door to the main conference room at the far end of our office suite opened. Out walked Mr. Davies, our usually stoic head of finance, followed by a man I hadn't seen in our specific office branch for at least a year, though I knew exactly who he was. Mr. Robert Henderson. Not Henderson Sr., the semi-retired, benevolent owner, but his son, the regional manager, the big boss. My cousin David. He stopped short, his eyes, a startlingly familiar shade of hazel that I knew so well, widening almost imperceptibly as he took in the chaotic scene. Carol, practically vibrating with uncontrollable rage, leaning over my desk, me, looking utterly shell-shocked, and the entire office frozen in a collective tableau of horrified curiosity. Carol, her back mostly to the conference room door, hadn't even registered his arrival. She was still ranting, her voice shrill. "I'm going to report you to the highest authorities." You have no right to behave this way. David, Mr. Henderson, to everyone else in the office, cleared his throat. It wasn't a particularly loud sound, but in the sudden, pin-drop silence that had enveloped the room, it echoed like a gunshot. Carol, mid-tirade, finally whipped around, probably expecting to see a lower-level manager she could also berate or enlist to her cause. Her eyes landed squarely on David. For a fleeting split second, a flicker of something, confusion, annoyance at being interrupted, crossed her contorted features. She clearly didn't recognize him as someone of significant importance, or perhaps, in her current state of unhinged fury, she simply didn't care. She might have even seen him as another potential ally to her twisted cause. "Excuse me," David said, his voice deceptively calm, but with an underlying edge of steel that I, having known him since we were kids building disastrously ambitious Lego castles, recognized instantly. It was his "I'm about to lay down the law, and someone is not going to like it" voice. "Is there some sort of problem here?" Carol, now seemingly emboldened by what she likely perceived as another authority figure she could manipulate and sway to her side, puffed herself up even further. "Yes, there most certainly is a problem," she declared, gesturing wildly and dramatically back at me. "This employee," she practically spat the word with contempt, "is consistently and deliberately unprofessional. She absolutely refuses to speak English in the workplace, even when directly and politely asked. She's creating a hostile and exclusionary environment for everyone, and frankly, I think she should be terminated immediately. She probably doesn't even belong in this country." She looked at David expectantly, as if anticipating his full agreement and swift action. David's expression remained impassive, but I saw his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly, a tiny muscle twitching near his ear. He let her finish her tirade, his gaze steady and unwavering. The silence stretched for another beat, thick and heavy, with unspoken tension. Then he looked past Carol, his eyes meeting mine directly. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of his lips, a private smile that only I would recognize as one of shared, exasperated amusement we often exchanged at chaotic family gatherings. "ISA," he said, his voice suddenly warm, achingly familiar, cutting through the charged atmosphere. "What's going on here?" The collective gasp from the onlookers was almost comical. Carol's had snapped towards me, her eyes wide with sudden, dawning confusion, then swiveled back to David. The casual, affectionate use of my family nickname, ISA, in that high-stakes, professional context, by the man she was trying to impress with her xenophobic rant, the regional manager himself, was like a tactical bomb going off in her carefully constructed narrative of my supposed inferiority and her own righteous indignation. I took a deep, steadying breath, my voice still a little shaky but gaining strength and clarity with every word. "David," I began, purposefully using his first name, cementing their shock. I was on a crucial video conference call with Mr. Alvarez from our new Argentinian client. I was clarifying a complex contractual point for him in Spanish, at his specific request, to ensure his full and complete understanding. Carol interrupted the call, started yelling at me for speaking Spanish, and then, as you just heard, demanded I be fired and deported. David nodded slowly, his gaze unwavering, absorbing my account before shifting back to Carol. And that's when his entire demeanor transformed. The calm, observant manager persona vanished, replaced by something much colder, much harder, much more formidable. His hazel eyes, so often warm and crinkling at the corners where he laughed at family jokes, now looked like chips of glacial ice. "Carol, is it?" he asked, his voice dangerously soft, each word precise. Carol, who had gone from a furious puce to a sickly, chalky pale, just nodded jerkily, her mouth opening and closing silently like a beached fish. All the fight, all the aggressive bluster, seemed to instantly drain out of her as the terrifying reality of who David was and his undeniable connection to me began to fully sink into her consciousness. Ms. Isabella Rodriguez, David stated, his voice now resonating with undeniable authority through the utterly silent office, is one of our top-performing and most valued project managers. She is also, as it happens, my cousin. Another collective, barely suppressed intake of breath rippled through the ranks of our stunned colleagues. Carol looked as if she'd been physically struck. Her perfectly applied, bright red lipstick now seemed garish and clownish against her suddenly ashen, almost green complexion. She is an exemplary employee, David continued, his eyes boring into Carol with an intensity that made even me flinch slightly on her behalf. And her bilingual skills are not a detriment, as you seem to believe, but a significant and invaluable asset to this company, especially as we continue to expand our operations into Latin American markets. What you just did, however, was not only incredibly unprofessional and disruptive to business, but also blatantly discriminatory, deeply offensive, and frankly, utterly disgusting. Carol finally spluttered, words tumbling out in a desperate, incoherent jumble. I didn't know. I just thought company policy, some sort of misunderstanding, she stammered, her earlier bravado completely extinguished, replaced by a desperate, scrambling panic. Her eyes darted around the room wildly, as if searching for an escape route, an ally, a hole to disappear into, but found only a sea of shocked, disapproving, and now slightly pitying faces. There is no company policy against speaking Spanish, Carol, David said, his voice like tempered steel. There is, however, a very strict, zero-tolerance company policy against harassment, discrimination, and the creation of a hostile work environment. You, in the last 5 minutes alone, appear to have violated all three, quite spectacularly. He paused, letting his words hang heavy in the air, each one a nail in her professional coffin. And from what ISA has briefly told me, and what I am absolutely certain of further, more thorough investigation with HR will confirm from her previously documented complaints, this isn't an isolated incident, is it? I saw my direct manager, Mark, who had been hovering nervously near his own cubicle like a frightened rabbit, visibly wince at that. He knew, and I knew, that he should have done more, much sooner. Carol opened her mouth, then closed it again, seemingly unable to form a coherent sentence. She looked small, deflated, all the aggressive, entitled care and energy suddenly and completely vanished. It was a misunderstanding, she finally whispered, her voice hoarse and barely audible. I was just concerned about clarity and professionalism. Clarity, David repeated, one eyebrow arching upwards in a perfect, cutting imitation of her earlier judgmental expression. Only his was backed by genuine, unassailable power. Oh, it was crystal clear to me, and I suspect to everyone else in this room, exactly what your concerns were, Carol. You were concerned that someone dared to speak a language you don't understand in your presence. You were concerned that someone from a different cultural background might actually be succeeding and thriving. Your so-called concerns are rooted in ignorance and bigotry, and that, Carol, has absolutely no place in this company. Or in any decent, civilized place, for that matter. He took one deliberate step closer to her, his presence utterly commanding. Effective immediately, your employment with Henderson Marketing is terminated. The words, stark and final, hung in the air. Fired. Just like that. Carol's jaw literally dropped. You can't do that, she shrieked, a last, desperate flicker of her old entitlement flaring up, but it was weak, pathetic, devoid of any real conviction. I'll sue. I'll go to the press. This is unfair. Dismissal. I have rights. David didn't even blink. You can certainly try, he said calmly, his composure absolute. But we have an entire office floor full of witnesses who just observed your unhinged, discriminatory tirade. We also have Isabella's meticulously documented history of your ongoing harassment. I suspect our legal team will be quite comfortable with our position. Now, please gather your personal belongings. Security will escort you from the premises. He gestured subtly, almost imperceptibly, and as if on cue, two uniformed security guards, who must have been discreetly alerted by Mr. Davies during the initial commotion, materialized almost silently by the main office entrance. Carol looked from David's implacable face to me, then to the approaching guards, her face finally crumpling. The anger and defiance gave way to a sort of wild, theatrical despair. "This is outrageous. I've never been treated so poorly in my entire life," she wailed, tears now streaming down her face, though they looked more like tears of pure fury and profound humiliation than any genuine remorse or understanding of her wrongdoing. She snatched her oversized designer handbag from her desk, haphazardly stuffing a few personal items into it, all the while muttering under her breath about how we'd all regret this, how she had connections, how this wasn't over. It was a classic Karen meltdown, a final, desperate performance, but without an audience willing to be intimidated or cowed, it just looked utterly pathetic and sad. The security guards gently but firmly guided her towards the exit. As she was being escorted past my desk, she shot me a look of pure, unadulterated venom. If looks could indeed kill, I'd have been vaporized on the spot. But all I felt in that moment was a profound, overwhelming sense of relief, mixed with a heady, unexpected elation. The office remained completely silent until the definitive click of the main door closing behind her signaled her final departure. Then, it was as if a collective, tension-filled breath was released by everyone simultaneously. Someone, I think it was Dave from accounting, even started a small, tentative clap which quickly, almost gratefully, spread throughout the room. David walked over to me, the stern, authoritative regional manager persona visibly softening, melting back into my familiar cousin. "ISA, are you okay?" he asked, his voice laced with genuine concern and warmth. "I am now, David," I said, a shaky but relieved laugh escaping me.
Wow. I
honestly don't know what to say. Thank you. Thank you so much. "Don't thank me," he said, giving my shoulder a comforting squeeze. "I'm just incredibly sorry you had to endure that vile behavior for so long. Mark," he then called over to my manager, who approached looking ashen-faced, like he was about to face a firing squad himself. "We need to have a very serious conversation about how this situation was allowed to escalate to this point. And HR needs to conduct an immediate review of its reporting procedures and responsiveness." Mark just nodded mutely, looking thoroughly chastened. The rest of that Tuesday afternoon was a bit of a blur. Mr. Alvarez, my Argentinian client, who had patiently and perhaps a bit bemusedly waited on the muted line throughout the entire dramatic episode, was incredibly understanding and even managed to make a lighthearted joke about how his contract negotiations were usually far less eventful. We quickly and successfully finalized the deal. Throughout the remainder of the day, my colleagues kept stopping by my desk, offering words of support, encouragement, and in some cases, quiet apologies for not speaking up sooner against Carol's behavior. It felt as if a massive, oppressive weight had been lifted, not just from my shoulders, but from the entire office. That evening, David called me at home. "So," he said, his voice full of suppressed laughter, "apart from nearly getting yourself deported by a lunatic, how was your Tuesday otherwise?" I couldn't help but laugh too, the tension finally, fully releasing. 'Cause I admitted for a terrifying moment there I was actually speechless. Her demanding I get deported, it was just so surreal, so beyond anything I could have imagined. "Some people," he said, his tone more serious now, "are just stubbornly determined to live in their own little, self-constructed bubble of ignorance and prejudice. I'm just incredibly glad I happened to be there at the right moment. Mom and Dad, not to mention Abuela, would have had my hide if they found out I let someone harass their Sabrina Consentida, their favorite niece, like that, and didn't do anything definitive about it.